Welcome everyone to another session of CISO's Corner, CISO's Huddle, CISO's Chat. I don't know, we went back and forth on the name of this, but at the end of the day, the point is that people who are making decisions every day for their security teams, people who are actually sitting in the boardroom, people who are working and really communicating with executives all day about the risks and security implications. This is the part where we go in and talk about different topics. My name is Victor Monga. I'm serving as governor for Osaka Orange County chapter. I am also president for CSA Cloud Security Alliance LA chapter. So with me today, I have my good friends and CISOs. Quincey, why don't we start with you and pass it on to Nemi about the introductions.
Hey everybody, Quincey Collins here, Chief Security Officer for Shepherd Mullen, Richter and Hampton.
Hi, Nemi George. I'm the VP for IT and CISO at Pacific Dental Services.
So today we thought we'd talk about, I'm not going to say buzzword, because I think we are past that. We are starting to adapt. We are starting to understand where XDR fits. What's the need of it? So it's no longer, I would say, buzzword. We're a little bit beyond. However, we are still at the point where it's not completely understood across all of the segments of security leadership. So we'll start with the quick introduction of where evolution of EDR. We used to have traditional antivirus. Everybody have loved it. They were relied on signatures. And now we have endpoint detection response where it's all about anomalies. It's all about a baseline and something which doesn't fit the baseline, maybe doesn't have signature just yet. And all of that came out of the light where we really can't rely on signatures. If you pick up any of the decent reports and you look at past 5 to 8 years, the 0 day so far have been increasing. They're not going down. And do you really think the security researchers are not doing a good job? Well, we are. So again, we talked about, or we heard EDR, NDR, SIEM, SOAR, and now again, as I was saying that, we are a little bit beyond the buzzword of XDR. So anomalies. And again, this is where it comes to a part where we really can rely on signatures. We went from traditional antivirus and we used to have the signatures, and now we have anomalies and again, EDR, endpoint detection response solutions, really looking at that anything deviating from that baseline. And that could be 0 day, that could be any other anomaly which doesn't fit in the signature. Same goes for on the network side. We used to have IDS on network side and IPS on network side, and we would go in and implement on our choke points, and we would look at. And we came to a point where it will actually reconstruct the whole stream, and we look at the signatures applying to it. That was great, but again, the fundamental flaw there was signatures. If there is no signature, an adversary can actually go in and evade those security solutions. And that's where NDR, network detection response, came in, where it can go in and sandbox it. It can go in and actually look at the anomalies in the network level. Quincey, why don't we start with this question where SIEM and SOAR, EDR, NDR, all of these are great solutions. Where does it fit? At what kind of maturity level for an organization?
Wow, that's a great first question. Where does it fit? I think in looking at the maturity level of an organization, there are a couple of things that I think are really important. The first thing is, do you have the personnel to utilize at least 30% of the capabilities of said system? If you don't have that, set up, there is no system that's going to provide a ton of value to an enterprise organization if you don't have knowledgeable personnel to actually set it up, understand the current configuration set, change the configuration and improve the configuration moving forward, and respond to threats. So, a lot of folks, I think, love to go to the end in responding to triaging threats and, going 150 miles an hour. But I think from a maturity standpoint, if you have one person in your, IT department and you don't have a security department, I think, you might want to take a look at outsourcing and getting some outside help. Now, if you're at the level of, you have X amount, 3, 4, 5, 7 security operators, and maybe some security management and executive level oversight for information security, that's where we start talking about, SOAR. That's when we start talking about, really expensive SIM systems. That's where we start talking about network detection and response systems, and those, I wouldn't call them nice to haves. I would say that, those types of systems are going to be higher in the hierarchy of information security. And the last thing that I'll say about that is, you've got to patch first, right? So let's sure, we're level setting and we're talking about network detection and response. We're talking about XDR, EDR, and all of those wonderful tools, but nothing replaces the basics, and the basics typically starts with patching.
I love that. Nothing replaces the basics. I might quote you on that one, Quincey. Maybe where we see that the evolution, where companies, organizations, security leaders are starting to look into EDR, NDR, SIEM, SOAR, or even they have implemented it. And Quincey alluded to that. Again, you must have a skill set. You must have the people to actually go in and not just install it, use it. You really need to use it, and you need to have those use cases. At one point, you think a security leader can call it that I am ready to go to the next step because I have these 5 prereq or these 3 things that I have for my organization, and I'm ready to go to the next step.
I think, to Quincy's point, everything in security is relative. There is no blanket answer. You may be starting off as a 1 or 2 man security operations engineering team, and then let's say you have the budgets to buy software, and you kind of ask yourself, where do you start from? Now, I will start where he started, which is the hygiene front, right? To doing your patch management, vulnerability assessments, identity and access, and some level of user awareness. These are critical foundational steps that you have to take. But let's take a contrast. A lot of people think you should have a SIM, for instance. So the point I want to make is, if I had the choice of implementing a SIM with a very small, green, or very low staff resource team, I will not. I would rather do something like an NDR solution that uses various layers of technology to filter through as much noise as possible, depending on how well you tune your system and depending on how mature your algorithms are, so that the things that do surface to me to work on as an analyst or an engineer are within, obviously, my remit, within my scope, and I'm not overwhelmed by the data that comes through. So that's the very first thing, is build your instrumentation based on your maturity, based on where you are in that journey. Otherwise, you may get tools that are implemented slightly out of sync, in which case you have pretty dashboards, and they may well be very useful for investigating things after the fact, but they're not necessarily going to help you in taking or adopting a proactive stance to having a mature information security program.
That's what I think I've seen as well, where SIEM is more like a compliance reason. A lot of us have jumped, and from there we feel that it's a very short leap where we can go and now think of SOAR as well, because SIEM is already looking at the data and we can build some sort of analytics on top of it. If that happens, go in and trigger this action, and that brings the SOAR part in it. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that kind of thing as well? Have you experienced that as well?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. And, I think this is where, going back to Quincey's introduction, a lot of SOAR applications are really based on maturity and knowledge. Essentially, a SOAR is just automating the responses that your team has. And so if you don't have a ton of expertise and you don't have a lot of experience or use cases built out within your organization, then implementing a SOAR, you essentially have a very shallow base to implement from, in which case, having an MDR solution in place or working with specialists who can come in and help you would be more relevant than I've seen a lot of SOAR implementations that are so basic in their implementation. For instance, you have a SOAR in place, and then all you're doing is, say, um, say, looking at your phishing simulation tests, and then responding to people who have failed the test. It's like, a lot of the training solutions can do that out of the box without needing a source, like, having a race car and sticking it in first gear and kind of driving around town. And so you got to be careful that you're getting the best out of your tools, and you've got to know your team, you've got to know your business.
Yeah, I think, Quincy, we recorded one session where we had the conversation about EDR versus NDR, which one you would pick. If you can only pick EDR versus NDR, I think at that point, we both agree upon that it's not mutually exclusive. You have to have EDR and NDR working in tandem, because at the end of the day, attacks are being originated at the endpoint level, at the workload level. And then the network is being used or leveraged for either to come inside your data center, public or private cloud, and then leveraging network, the data is being exfil out. Now with XDR, the term, we're trying to combine these two, EDR and NDR. Where do you feel that security leader would be able to determine that I have evolved from traditional signature-based endpoint and network solutions, and now I have EDR, NDR, but they are really not giving me the unified solution to really look at the intelligence that I need between endpoint, workloads, and network? Where do you feel that as a security leader, that the mindset or the thought process you would go through and be like, what is missing today that these two solutions isolated are not giving me?
I think I would first start with taking a look at each of the different enclaves that I'm responsible for, and really understanding, what my capabilities are for those different enclaves, those different networks, those different systems, different business units, and really take a hard look at what my capabilities are for from a detection and response standpoint. So I see XDR as being, kind of at the top of the tree, right? Because it does sophisticated analysis of multiple log sources and really just correlates everything, contextualizes everything, and gets you, some curated information based on what's happening, right, across all of those different data sources. So the prerequisite for an XDR system is having all of those data sources, right? A prerequisite for having all of those data sources is having someone to actually configure those systems to log appropriately, to be at the appropriate protection levels, and really have the knowledge of your entire network to make sure that nothing is missed, right? Because you could have all these expensive systems and not have a absolutely critical log source because, I don't know, nobody flipped it on, right? So, I think, if we start at the bottom of the pyramid with people, and then on top of that, we have systems, right, in the middle, and then on top of that, we have configuration and capability. If we use those, crawl, walk, run steps, you can actually get much further, much faster, right? So, at the very top of the tree, I see source systems, and source systems are awesome and very, very helpful if you have the personnel that can do the job. If you don't have the personnel to do the job, you're going to have a really expensive paperweight. So, when you ask if, I should be looking at this or I should be looking at that, if I should be zeroing in on one particular section of, how I should go about my XDR journey, I think it's really small, short, and very deliberate steps to a sophisticated security architecture. And that's what XDR is. It's a very sophisticated system, a collection of log sources that really gets you into a better visualization and better awareness of your network and what's actually happening.
What I have seen, and this is just my personal speculation, where XDR came out of necessity of that tier 1 triage, where it's literally rinse and repeat. if this happens, do this. And all you have to do is make sure that if an alert popped up on the network side, go make sure on the endpoint side, if this IP was seen somewhere, if this process was seen somewhere, if that same binary, let's say whatever that executable MSI was seen somewhere, that first level triage, I think was something that's really a burden on security practitioners, people who are actually behind the keyboard, and that manual process was way too much, where we could really use the human part and tell them that, hey, go do a sample check or take the escalations where we were able to actually go in and quarantine one of the devices or quarantine one of the networks, and it was not supposed to be. That's where human is going and responding it. But for the rest of the 95%, it's rinse and repeat. If you find this, do this. And that's where I have seen XDR come in and playing as a great use case, that first preliminary tier one triage, it's automated now, because it's connecting two different isolated systems between endpoint workload, and again, I call that operating system level security with network. Nemi, what's your take on it? When do you think that the maturity or the conversation of these connected telemetry or these signals that needs to happen?
I think, again, all the things you're saying are so spot on, but the term XDR, SOAR, EDR, NDR has been so overused within the industry, not necessarily by professionals, but by the product folks, right? Or I should say by practitioners, more by the product teams and the marketing machine, that as we know what I'm referring to. And we get to this point where when you take away the labels, we're really saying the same thing. And I love the way, Quincey, what you said and what Victor, you mentioned about under the covers, we're talking about how can you respond consistently with a fairly robust set of responses to known and unknown threats, events, incidents that occur on your network. Now, just taking that line, for instance, some people will call that XDR, which is extended as it's taking that EDR, NDR plus, right? But then when you flip that on its head, you have a lot of organizations that use XDR to effectively mean an endpoint solution, right? I happen to use an XDR product, which is only on my endpoints. So is that an EDR or is that an XDR, right? Now, if I had a SOAR solution that was doing the orchestration after the fact, after the logs have been extrapolated and moved into a secondary device or service, and then I'm now taking action back within my environment, does that make it more SOAR? Does that make it an XDR solution, right? So my point is that, ultimately the functionality is kind of what I'm focused on, and that is, to your question, Victor, where should they all come together? The endpoint is now making some assumptions here, and the assumption I'm making to your last question, if you could choose between one or the other, if you really had to, I don't think you should, but if you had to because of budgets, resources, and so on, I would focus on the endpoint where most things, not everything, most things come together. But this makes an assumption that may not always be true, that on the network layer, you may not have an explicit, solution called an NDR, but you have next-gen firewalls and other network layer protection in quotes, right? It could be just detection, response, and so on, that give you some level of network-based detection, protection, and hopefully response. And you've got to take all that together. But I think the one thing that we are all very agreed on is it's a layered structure. And the best defenses are layered defenses. And these questions become more relevant where you're not able to stack your technology, and you have to make those decisions that we all have to make at some point, but none of us want to, if you have to prefer or prioritize one against the other.
And that's a really good point, I think. And again, Quincey, you and I also recorded a podcast about cloud security, and we talked about the risks. So again, no podcast or any session can be successful if we don't talk about cloud security these days, because again, the perimeter has been really busted wide open. There's no more perimeter where we can really call that as a castle. And that really goes back to my argument about NDR versus EDR when people are picking up one or the other. And again, we all agree that it shouldn't be one or the other, but if you really have to, then where does NDR fits? Where is your that one network? Can you really claim that this is one network and this is where all of my control data or even uncontrolled data goes through? Quincey, you have looked at the cloud solutions. You have also been through the cloud journey. And where do you feel that does XDR fits the detection, or do you think it's detection and prevention as well when it comes to the cloud aspects of the security?
I think a prevention first strategy is number one. When I look at network detection and response, I think it's definitely important. But that's different than, a next generation firewall, application firewall, or the like. It's important to delineate both of those two technologies. So I would say that you get your perimeter sorted first, and then you can do your network detection and response, or possibly there's some license key or something that allows you to do network detection and response, through your firewall possibly. So, if you have to kind of pick a perfect time, there's no perfect time for everything, obviously. But you do what you can with what you have. And, I like what Nemi said earlier about layered defenses, right? In my prior life, in the Department of Defense, we, spoke to defense in depth, all of the time. And, it's, what's old is now new again, right? We have defense in depth. We have all of these different technologies that are layered, that, need to be configured appropriately in order to make sure that, we're doing everything that we can to protect the assets, the identities and information that we're essentially trusted with. So, in looking at network detection and response as it, kind of overlays with cloud and traditional on-premise environments, I think every tool and technology is important if it's configured correctly, and it can be useful. Definitely network detection and response is higher in the, let's say, hierarchy of security tools. Higher meaning it comes after, typically, our traditional defenses. This is something that's a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more nuanced, and it's newer, which means that they're still working through these detections. If you look at some of the greatest breaches that have occurred over the last 2 to 3 years, have these advanced network detection and response systems caught all of them all of the time, right? So security is an iterative process, and you've got to go back to basics first. Make sure you have your secure configuration baselines. Make sure that you have individuals watching, checking, trust but verify. And then you can move forward to these really cool, new, robust systems that look really cool. And, I hope that I hope it works out for everybody who installs those tools on their networks.
Yeah, I think one of the things, again, maturity of the organization, maturity of your team, and finally, where you're heading, that needs to be fundamentally clear before we go talk about the solutions, tools, platforms. I think going the other way around, that there's a something new shiny buzzword or new shiny tool. Based on that, let me make sure my next 3 years of journey is going in and building a visibility detection or modernizing my SOC because there's a new solution out there. I think that's where some of the security leaders are facing some struggle because it didn't go well based on strategy, based on the vendor pitch, if you will.
I look at these wonderful vendor pitches and I love them because, and I sit on a lot of vendor pitches because it really helps me kind of get a little creative and ask those questions, right? Because, you ask those really salient, important questions to the vendors, and a lot of times they're going to have a good answer. Sometimes they're not going to have a good answer, but you can't really go based upon the vendor pitch, the vendor press documents for whatever technology. And I'm just speaking generally here. I think everyone has to POC as if their life depended on it, because you're responsible for a certain amount of budget associated with that tool. You're also responsible for the people hours associated with configuring, maintaining, and operating said tooling. So, it could be a huge waste. And at the end, if you don't do it correctly, if you don't get it right, you're actually further, you've decreased your capability because you're looking at a bunch of false positives. You have maybe burnt out your team trying to fix problems that occurred in your first 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Maybe you've gone through a penetration test and it didn't even detect on any of the attacker activity, right? So you've got to really POC your tooling, appropriately, and whatever appropriately means to you, that's what you've got to go as hard as you can, as far as you can, as fast as you can in that POC. Extend those POCs out as long as you can in order to get as much information as possible, because nothing is worse than having a security system, some security tooling that your team has worked really hard on that you're just not going to use, right?
And that's really important. I think one of the key part is that to go in first and run some sort of either tabletop or simulation, emulation, do something to find the gaps. Don't go jump on the tool or solution or platform. And it could be the other way around as well. You look at, hey, here are the new capabilities of a new solution, but do I have a gap of that today? Atomic Red Team is a great example, open source. I always recommend people go run that. Look at it. If currently in your organization, if there's a gap for it, if your current solution is actually cannot provide you visibility or detection or prevention, then you have a substantial case to go in and make that we need something new. And then you also have requirements out of that this is what I want to test because currently I don't have it. You go the other way around, you go in and be like, oh, this is what this tool can do. Let's go install it. To your point, our teams are going to spend hours and hours and hours. Everybody loves shiny tools. Who doesn't? At the end of the day, vendors make their money. Our team is excited about it. But what is the actual use case? What are those specific items you're trying to get out of it so that it really helps the maturing your security program? Nemi, you're coming out of budget season. I know we talked about it last week. Talk about the money part. How do security leaders are talking about justifying XDR? Because at the end of the day, it's not like there's a completely new use case. We're talking about connecting the telemetry, connecting the signals, which you are getting today. So at the end of the day, it is that it's a little frustrating because my SOC or my level 1 or my analysts have to go in and manually connect those dots. Otherwise, it'll be connected automatically under this solution. How are boards reacting to that kind of statement, or are you making a different play to justify XDR?
I think, as always, when you need to request for funding or budgets for these solutions, you have to be very clear on the return on investment. And that's something that is thrown out a lot of times. And you've got to be very careful because every vendor out there has some ROI calculator that they use, and some of those calculators are so ludicrous. You have an ROI calculator that tells you essentially, hey, look, you are going to save so much money, and you look at some of those funds and they're 10x more cost than your entire security team put together, which is like, how can I save this much money when I don't even spend this much? But the point is, first of all, what are you trying to solve? You've talked about the technology aspect of it, but let me just put some added color there. Are you looking to speed up the amount of the speed to detect? Are you looking to reduce dwell time within your network? Are you looking to increase the number of tickets, events per analyst within your organization? Or could be the absolute reverse of that. Are you looking to put in layers of intelligence that reduces the amount of tickets, incidents that are assigned to your analysts? Right? Are you looking to reduce false positives and so on and so forth? There are all these things that are very clear, metric driven things that you can predetermine before going into any request for funding. And the level of stringency certainly does change between organizations. But my point is whether your organization is strict in these and tell you as a security leader to present this as part of the budgets, the corporate planning cycle or not, you should still do it. You should have your internal little sort of checklist to ask yourself, am I getting value from these tools, based on whatever the vendor said or based on what you hope to achieve out of the tools. That's the very first thing. The second thing, which both of you kind of touched on, is don't always go with the headline. Everything we've talked about here, you could really break down to, are you able to identify or detect what's going on within your network or your environment? And I'm using network as a very broad term. It could be an endpoint, could be an application, could be your core underlying network infrastructure. Are you able to detect what's going on? Once you do that, are you able to identify if this is a one-off? Is this a trend? Is this more widespread? And what's the criticality of what, this is? Are you being targeted and so on and so forth? And are you able to respond to it? Once you've asked yourself those questions, the other question I would ask, even before thinking about new technology, is can I do all of this, or at least most of this, using my existing tools? Because you find that a lot of vendors are not solving anything drastically new. They may tell you that they're solving it faster. They may tell you they have an easier way to do it, but they're not necessarily doing anything novel or anything new. So in that case, you've got to ask yourself, for that extra speed, for that extra fidelity that you get in terms of lower false positives and all that, is that worth the extra cost? And the level of scrutiny that you put yourself under, that's entirely up to you. And in some cases, driven by the type of organization you work for. But as security leaders, we have to be crystal clear on these things. And then once you've done that, the final piece to all of this is, how do you then tell if you got there? And there's so many ways to do that, right? Most vendors nowadays, at least good ones, would have some type of customer success manager that goes beyond a PM who is simply looking at a date and time for you to check the boxes to say this has been completed and transitioned, and off they go. What does success look like? Something we echo so much, and not just security circles, but it's almost like a business statement. What does success look like? But you really have to define what success looks like for your organization, so whether or not you're successful, what those gaps are, and then you can at least position yourself true north to at least getting closer to solving.
Quincey, I'll toss this question to you as well, since I know security leaders, it's again, one of the struggles is, how do I justify this cost? And at the same time, how do I make sure the time to value is something that I can actually document? And again, because we have to go back to the board and ask for the money for the next solution as well to solve business problems. So where does XDR in your mind fits, and how does a security leader can go in and explain the time to value to executives?
Well, explaining the time to value is an important aspect of any solution that you have. Nemi mentioned a few metrics that were important as far as the time that an analyst takes to triage an incident, close something out. So just imagine if you have 8 different dashboards that you have to, log into. Whereas you could have just had, and maybe an XDR solution if it's configured appropriately, to be able to do that and stitch those together on your behalf. Not only is it a time savings from a analyst or operator perspective, but it also reduces the risk of a breach. Now, you don't want to be a doom and gloom person, saying, hey, the average breach is $4.2 million. You install this system and bang, you saved $4.2 million or $8.4 million if we just say, hey, there could have been 2 breaches, right? But what we're actually forgetting is, all of those other systems that you have, where do they fit in line, right? So, impact and likelihood is typically how we manage or classify risk, right? What is the impact of said risk and what is the likelihood of said risk? And, XDR is definitely at the top of the tree. And, it's important to really explain the value, but don't overpromise or inflate the value. You've really got to be conservative. And I think, being conservative in your estimates as far as the time saved, the threats that are decreased or the risks that are decreased associated with whatever system, whether it's XDR, EDR, NDR, what have you, being transparent is the most important. Now, Nemi had mentioned that vendors have these calculators, and you've got to wonder sometimes the efficacy of said calculators, because they're essentially built to paint a story, to create a story and illustrate the value of their product that they're attempting to sell you. So you've got to take any calculator that you see out there with a grain of salt. But when we're looking at essentially proving or demonstrating the value to the individuals that we have to show, to essentially say, hey, this is worth it and this is why, you've got to be concise, you've got to be direct, straight to the point, and you've got to answer that one simple question: what do we get if we purchase this tool, service, or software? Answer that one question, and typically you'll be all right.
As we are walking towards wrapping this session, I think I'll ask this last question to both of you, what is XDR still missing? Because we hear different definitions from either analysts, or we hear definitions from vendors, and whatever fits their bill, and they provide that this is what XDR means. But I think, in my opinion, it's still missing email and identity, because XDR is seen as an EDR, which has some sort of data lake to justify SIEM, and finally can do some sort of automation, which is still shaky at best right now, that automation part. But the email data, because still top threat is phishing, and identity, because hackers are not breaking in, they're logging in. So in my opinion, that's what it's missing. What's your take?
I think, first of all, I agree with that. But let me take a step back. I think the biggest problem we have with XDR, which I alluded to earlier, is really a question of definition. Let's start with firewalls, right? Everyone, if you've been in the security space for 30 years, or you've been in the security space for 1 year or 1 day, you ask anyone, in that spectrum, what a firewall is and what a firewall should do, and I bet you they will come up with broadly the same answer, right, of what a firewall is. It is very clear, very well defined. Everyone kind of understands what it is. By contrast, when you talk about XDR, totally different. We have XDR products that are essentially an EDR product plus, with a little small plus next to it. You have some XDR products that are an EDR and an NDR, just on their own, agent-based. You have XDR products that are essentially some analytical tool on top of a data lake that has some SOAR capability, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think we really need to start with what is a clear definition for this space. And then once we do that, I agree that you cannot have an XDR solution that, one, does not incorporate your cloud environment to your traditional infrastructure environment. You cannot have an XDR product that doesn't have some aspects of user behavior analysis, and that includes identity, right? And it also includes, all the things that we mentioned earlier. It's got to be all of those things, because if you don't have that all coming together, then you're not able to respond. And so what's missing? I think it's that as close to a single pane of glass as we can on everything that represents a valuable asset on your network. That is your data, your people, your infrastructure, the identities of your individuals, obviously. You pull all that together, you have the intelligence around it, and you have the ability to respond within the XDR solution or using integrations to existing solutions that you have within your environment already. That gives you the full picture, and I think that's what we need to strive to.
How about you, Quincy? What do you think that XDR is still missing?
I would say that third-party integrations of any system, anytime, anywhere, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, depending on who opened up which API for which system. To me, it should be, let's say, easier, and everybody wants an easy button, right? But for a new tool that the vendor hasn't necessarily integrated as yet, open API access for all of these tools and integrations, quick, fast integrations, and quick time to value and time to operationalize said log sources, said systems into your XDR system. I think that's still a bit of a ways away. Just easily being able to onboard and easily interoperate with the many different systems that we have. I think that is still a bit of a ways away. I mean, obviously, the large XDR players have a lot of different integrations, and they probably hit 60, 70% of the tools. But still looking for everything, right? You ask a security professional, what do they want? And obviously, it's everything, right? So yeah, I'm excited to see what the space is going to look like in the future. I'm excited to see what's going to happen, who's going to be leading the charge from a vendor perspective, and who are the players that are small right now that are going to be big later. I love technology. I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
I think one last thing to add there to your point, Quincy. I'm interested to see how many of these remain standalone, because when you really go and speak to a lot of startups, as we do in our roles, a lot of these startup companies have been started by engineers and folks from the established players who've just left out of frustration because they see this tiny gap that they've been talking about, and no one within their wider organizations has focused on it, and so they branch out on their own and they do their own thing. And so when do the big boys realize that, hey, we could have had it all? And when do they go, mop up these smaller players and build some of these capabilities back into their solutions to have a more robust solution? So that's always interesting to see. And also the flip to that is how many of these breakaway, silo industry or new industries were actually just built to almost feed back into the larger ecosystem, right? And so that's always an interesting thing to look at.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're excited to see how XDR fits in the business use cases to move along and help maybe business innovation, and maybe some of the things that business had been struggling for a while, and now maybe XDR or the use cases of XDR maybe help them out. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. Again, really appreciate it. And hopefully our audience will enjoy it. If they have any follow-up questions, obviously we'll bring you back.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks, Nemi.
Thank you.
Thank you.